In the last chapter, we talked about backgrounds and we spent a lot of time talking about colors and color theory. In this chapter, we move on, continuing to manipulate elements as we start off with manipulating its opacity. So let's jump into it and see, how does that work? How do we change the opacity of elements? It's time for us to steer our attention back into our CSS. I want to talk about visibility. In previous examples, we saw how we control our alpha using an RGBA, where we could control an alpha and set its visibility in that way to be 0. But really, we never really want to use RGBA to set a visibility of no visibility. And the reason is because that is still being rendered. And rendering of this type of kind is really intensive on a processor. Like we were saying, also alpha channels are intensive for a processor. So I want to go ahead and show you an example using the article. I want to go ahead and make that article invisible. To do that, I'm going to go into the article itself. I'm going to put here a comma here. Notice how my display here on my alpha channel is of the background, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to break a line here and push everything up a little bit. So let me add here a few more break lines so it'll be in a good position on the screen. And I'll put the value opacity and set that opacity to a value between 0 or 1. Now, the opacity value, contrary to the alpha channel that only controls the background, will control the whole instance. So, for example, if I set the opacity to be 0.5 and I go back into my application and click on refresh, we'll see that everything, including descendants, which descendants are items inside of that item, will now be faded out in a 50% opacity. Again, if I wanted to, I could have set that opacity to be 0 as well. The only problem with configuring and setting my opacity to be 0 is that it is processor intensive because the browser itself has to process that element and display it. Now, actually display it as not displayed. Now, contrary to opacity, and I'm going to go ahead here and just set here maybe an opacity of 0.8 just so it's still there, that property, so you could look at it. And I'm just going to go ahead and also make sure that you have here a comment so you know what the ranges are, and the ranges are between 0 and 1. Alright, so let's move on to the next property that I want to talk about that relates to color and visibility. And that is the visibility property. Now, the visibility property by default has the value of visible, which, as the name implies, means it is currently visible. Underneath that, other options are hidden. Now, the hidden option basically hides our element completely. So it doesn't really matter if we have an opacity of 0.8, our element is invisible. But the space itself that controls that element, the space that is registered for that element, is still in position. So nothing here is moved. The item is here, it's just not being rendered at all. It's a little bit easier on the processor because there is no rendering. The only thing the processor needs to do is save the space there for that element. Now, the hidden property in its default, not only default, by default it will make everything inside, all internal elements inside of it, to be invisible as well. But that's only a default which you can override. For example, if I wanted to override the questions item and say, hey, for the questions itself, which is a sub item, it's a child of this item, so I'm going to go ahead here and just break a few lines. I actually want to have a visibility that is visible. So I'm going to go ahead here and set a visibility of visible. Now notice the default that was of visible that was there originally is not that default anymore because the question automatically inherited the article's visibility, which basically made it hidden. By setting it to be visible, now the article itself will be visible even though that a wrapper around is not. And notice how all the children of that property are now getting that configuration, that visibility. Now I'm going to go ahead here in the comments itself again, and I'm just going to add the different various options that you could put in for visibility. And again, we have here our visibility that is the default visibility unless there is some inheritance going on, unless a child is inheriting a feature that is different like we saw in our article. No matter where the position is, if the question is before or after, it doesn't matter because this is a descendant, which its laws are applied after the laws of the article, because it's closer down in the chain of line to the item itself. Now, hidden we've saw. Collapse we're not going to see in this title, we're going to see it in a future title, but that relates mainly to working with tables. And as we're not working with tables right now, we're going to ignore it in general. I want to move on to one more topic. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and just comment it out because I want to talk about another way to control visibility. Now, this new other way of controlling visibility, and I'm going to go ahead here. Oh, that was actually fine. But I'm going to go ahead here and just dim out our visibility, put it into the comments. I'm going to go into the property that's called display, and there's a lot of things that we could do with the display. We're not going to talk about all of them now, but throughout our course we're going to meet a lot of them. First thing we're going to see in it is the none. Now the none, contrary to visibility, although it will look like it does the same thing maybe in the first second, does something completely different, and notice the difference. The difference is when I set the display to none, it actually is not accounted at all, which means that items that are flushed after it are going to be flushed immediately, removing that space of that item. Another difference between that item is that children cannot override. So if I go inside of my display here and I try to enter something else inside of the question, it would not adhere to it because if the parent has set it to be none, then all the children below it are automatically none. They cannot override it. Contrary to visibility hidden, where children can override. Alright? And the logic is very simple because if the whole element is gone, then it really doesn't matter if internal items are visible because that whole node is just not visible. Alright, so that covers that item, and that's really our conversation about opacity in general and how to make something visible or not visible, and the differences between visibility, hidden visibility, versus the display none.